Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hello, I'm Jim Holcomb, President and CEO of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, today's podcast host. Today we're going to take a deeper dive into the recent passage of earned sick time and minimum wage laws and what it all means for employers and employees. A big welcome today to Wendy Block, the Michigan Chamber Senior Vice President of Business Advocacy. She knows all the ins and outs of what went on, why it happened, and how we got there. So we're excited to have Wendy with us today. Wendy, thank you for joining.
Yes, thank you.
Let's start, with a kind of a quick level setter, some background. How did we get to where we are? This was such a fight, and it was something that's been going on for several years. What was kind of the timeline of how we did this?
Right. So we get this question a lot. Like, how did this even happen? How are we in this spot that we have these two new sweeping laws, one on earned sick time, one on minimum wage? And the quick history lesson is going back to 2018, there were two ballot initiatives being circulated to get these issues on the ballot. So think about when you go to the farmer's market and somebody says like, hey, will you sign this petition to get this issue on the ballot? That's kind of what happened. And the proponents of these two proposals, both were kind of being funded by out-of-state groups. They did get sufficient signatures to qualify for the November 2018 ballot. But the Constitution, our Michigan Constitution, talks about the role of the legislature when an issue qualifies through the ballot through the citizen initiative process. It says the legislature can do nothing or they can reject outright, meaning it goes to the voters to decide. But it also talks about how the legislature can adopt. And when they adopt, they have the right to amend subsequently with a simple majority vote. Unlike if it goes to the people and it requires a supermajority vote, a higher threshold. And so the legislature said in 2018, we're going to adopt, but we don't think these laws as written are workable. They're not very implementable for businesses in the real world, and they have unintended consequences for employees. So they adopted in the fall of 2018, and they subsequently amended in December of 2018 and put into place what was, up until February 21, our current minimum wage and earned paid sick leave laws. But that action, that adopt and amend action, was challenged in the courts by these proponents. And we had this protracted legal battle about this, and we had the Supreme Court come out with their monumental decision in late July of 2024 saying, legislature, you had the right to adopt and amend, but you did not have the right to amend in that same legislative session. You would have had to wait until 2019. And so they ordered these two ballot proposals that were never voted on by the people into law on February 21. And that has now been the legislative fight. How are we going to, if and how are we going to amend these again?
So it seems like it got into an era where the Michigan Chamber is always advocating for, we want rule of law jurists. We want them
100%.
to respect the separation of powers. Legislature, you legislate. Judicial branch, you kind of call balls and strikes. And it seems like they kind of crossed over on this. I know there was a lot of consternation and a lot of discussion back and forth over the years of when this happened. But I don't think we can overestimate what a monumental deviation from traditional jurisprudence this was, that the court would get involved and say, Constitution doesn't talk about this. In fact, it kind of goes the other way, but we think it should go this way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the Michigan Chamber was engaged in this legal fight. We filed briefs at kind of all levels of the fight, from the lower courts all the way up to the state Supreme Court. We're a strong voice for our members saying, look, we do not think the Constitution says that the legislature cannot do this. The words in the Constitution don't support you ordering these ballot proposals that were never voted on by the people into law. But despite that, this activist Supreme Court said, we don't really care what the Constitution says. We are interested in making sure that these things become law. And so, we got to the end of our appeals, and then we had to figure out how were we going to pivot. And that meant pivoting and going back to the legislature and saying, we need your help. We need you to amend these again to make them more workable and implementable.
And like you said, there are two issues here. Let's kind of separate those. Let's start with minimum wage. Where is the minimum wage going now? I don't think we have to recap everything that was in previous version, but what do people need to know about going forward? Yeah,
so on February 21, the minimum wage increased from $10.56 an hour to $12.48 an hour. And the minimum wage is increasing annually until it reaches $15 an hour on January 1 of 2027. But in 2028, inflationary increases will start to take place. So the minimum wage will go on autopilot. The legislative changes put that factor based on the Midwest CPI, which is a more favorable factor than what was in that court-ordered language. On the tipped minimum wage, this is the big story, right? How tipped workers were kind of coming out in droves saying, we don't want this. We like the system as it is. So the ballot language would have eliminated what's known as the tipped minimum wage and taken it to 100% of the full minimum wage, basically said to tipped employees, you make the full minimum wage. Good luck getting 20% on top of any bill that you're giving to a customer. And instead, the legislature said we're going to keep the current 38% in place, and we're going to increase that by 2% a year until we hit 50% in 2031. So tipped employees will make 50% of whatever the minimum wage actually is in 2031. We can't say yet. And that kind of keeps that current system in place where tipped workers are guaranteed to make the full minimum wage, but they make this year 38% of the full minimum wage. When you add their tips on top, they have to be making the full minimum wage, or the employer must pay the difference. And it's illegal not to pay the difference. And I
think that's a key distinction a lot of the public doesn't understand. No one is ever going to work for less than minimum wage.
100%.
It's just maybe how your paycheck, maybe you have a really slow shift at a restaurant, you didn't get enough customers, you didn't get enough tips. The employer's going to make that up, and it was always that way. And it's just a percentage of what that gap could be is what's changing.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of education that has gone on with the public through this, because tipped employees have been very outspoken about the fact that they like the system as it is today, that many of these people are making $20, $30, $40, $100 an hour when they're doing their shifts. And, the feeling based on the experience of other states is that tip habits change at the table when you move the system, when you change the system to change it to one where somebody is making the full minimum wage. And so I think tipped employees are pleased with this outcome. Certainly, so are restaurants, who would have seen an over 280% increase in their labor costs. Like 280%. I think I challenge the average business to think through what that exercise would look like in their workplace if government said, here's a mandate that you have to increase everyone's wages by 280%. Good luck.
I think it's interesting too, as we think this through. Tipped wage workers in Michigan are saying, don't do this. And it was out-of-state money, signature gatherers who don't give the full story of what they're asking you to sign. And it kind of goes on autopilot. Now it's been out-of-state, millions of dollars from people who don't even live in Michigan who've brought this problem to our doorstep.
Yeah, and frankly are saying now they're going to seek a referendum. They're going to kind of try to go back to the voters.
They didn't cause enough damage. They got to do more.
Exactly. It's really astonishing. This is a good example, though, of our citizen initiative process and how if you have a few $1 million, right? Not everybody has that, but really, and you've got a populist, sounds good on paper sort of issue. It's fairly easy to make something happen in Michigan. And that is a real concern, because people don't dig into the details. They just look at this. Unlike if it goes through the legislative process, at least there's some debate and discussion.
How concerned is everybody, just even with the CPI increases every year? When you're taking the minimum wage, those are supposed to be entry-level jobs. They usually are not a high skill set job. It's where you learn soft skills, you learn some skills that transfer, and hopefully you work your way up the ladder. Are we making the floor so high at some point that those jobs go away as well?
I think there's a real concern about the impact on youth workers, and also the impact, and this should have been the first point, of how this impacts more rural areas of our state. Certainly in urban areas, a $15 minimum wage isn't that big of a concern. But, as you add that CPI, where does that grow? And does that kind of get out of whack with where the market really is today? But in certain areas of our state, this is going to be harder for, some employers than others.
So I kind of look at this, we talked about it internally. It's not a relief, but you kind of you can breathe a little easier if you're a restaurateur. What are you hearing from our restaurant members and how they see the state going forward?
Yeah, I think they're fairly pleased or okay with kind of where this landed. I think the ballot proposal kind of showed them what death looks like for their industry, and to say that you're landing at 50% of where it otherwise would have gone. People feel like, okay, I can at least plan for that. It's 2% a year. It's maybe not ideal, but it at least doesn't kind of blow the cap off on this and really put me in a position where there are no good answers. Menu price increases just aren't a way to get me there for that 280% increase. So generally, I think people feel like, oh, okay.
How'd the politics play out on this? I know it's a bipartisan deal, but I believe there was more Republicans than Democrats.
100%. So Republicans really kind of carried the votes on both of these issues, this and earned sick time. There were bipartisan votes on both issues, but this happened, in the Democratic-controlled Senate with a majority of Republicans coming along or kind of taking that leadership role. So it was kind of one of those weird issues where you don't normally see a chamber vote for something where the minority party actually puts up more votes than the majority party.
Especially when you talk about government, essentially a government mandate or government intruding into business. You have the Republicans kind of saying, hey, this is so bad, we're going to try to fix this, and Democrats were letting it kind of play out. Is that just a function of who the supporters are for the respective caucuses?
Yeah, there's a lot of politics at play in all of this, right? Then I think up to the end, the labor unions were kind of threatening to use this as a lifetime scorecard issue for them. You, of course, had these two out-of-state groups that were pushing hard on legislators to do nothing, in particular Democrats. So I think the fact that something actually got done is a testament to the fact that there's a big power of the constituent on these issues, that the constituent voice here really couldn't be ignored and was so great that even a chamber that really didn't want to do anything, who were okay with letting this go into effect as written, felt like they had to change.
The other part of the equation, we're talking about the two issues today, minimum wage and earned sick time, is the earned sick time. It seems to, in my estimation, has a broader impact across the state. And so give us kind of the thumbnail on that of what the issue is and what we were working against.
Right. So this issue is definitely more weedy and complicated, right? But at its core, kind of the issue is to mandate or require employers of all sizes and types to require employees to take earned sick time, to create a system where employees could accrue 1 hour for every 30 hours worked up. You don't stop counting at 72 hours, but you can cap usage at 72 hours in a given year. And, from a business perspective, we, of course, Michigan Chamber does not like workplace mandates. We feel like this is overreach on the government's part, that the market and the desire to attract and retain quality workers and basically ensures that this sort of benefit is there for the vast majority of workers across our state. But despite that, we realized that we were not going to be able to repeal the mandate itself. But a big issue here was more just is this implementable? Is it workable in workplaces across Michigan? And even if you had a far more generous plan in place, the proposal that had been initially put on the ballot would have forced those employers to make very drastic changes to their very generous paid time off benefits. And that just didn't make any sense, right?
Why would you want to hurt the employee that's already benefiting?
Exactly, right? By forcing employers to divide out earned sick time from other banks of time, et cetera. So we kind of set off on a mission to educate lawmakers that while this may sound good on paper, in practice, it really doesn't work and is potentially going to very much hurt the very employee you're intending to help. And just said, we want you to do some key things. We want to make this less disruptive. We want to make sure that it is implementable. And so the legislature kind of responded to that call. We didn't get everything that we wanted. We were looking for exemptions for small businesses and certain classifications of employees, including part-time and seasonal employees. That did not happen. But by and large, the other pieces that we were seeking to kind of streamline how this works and to give employers more discretion about how to set this up and how to implement it in their workplace, those things did make it across the finish line and are now in effect.
Were there any exemptions, or is everybody covered?
So there's some very minor exemptions for different employees. So some employees who have the ability to schedule their own work and they can't be retaliated against if they don't schedule, they're exempt. Unpaid trainees and unpaid interns are explicitly exempt, although I would argue they were exempt under the original proposal. And then student workers were also exempt. So kind of people that are employers that are using people under 18 and they're complying with the Youth Labor Standards Act, they are also exempt, but really very limited in scope in terms of exemptions.
Governmental entities covered?
Everyone but the U.S. federal government is covered. So even the state of Michigan and our 1,800 local units of government across Michigan, including fire departments and police stations, 911 centers, they all need to comply with the same mandate that every other organization. So, I think what is important to remember is there are no exemptions for nonprofit agencies. There's a lot of misinformation out there. But this issue extends much further than just a traditional business issue. And that's because nonprofits and local governments and the state government and really any entity that employs one or more workers has to comply with this mandate.
So if it's covering, say first responders and everybody across that kind of spectrum, how does that work if somebody can just no show or call in and say, I'm not coming in, and it's got to be, as I recall, it's either in 1 hour increments or the smallest increment you record time?
Yeah, so the default is 1 hour unless you as an employer choose a smaller limit. They did change that. But, 1 hour is not necessarily workable in all workplaces. It might be in an office setting, but it might not be on an assembly line or something, or in a home health care setting.
Sure.
The notification procedures were somewhat fixed, I would argue. So it kind of says, well, if you have a policy in your workplace, you can kind of set how you want to get notice from your employees. And if they don't follow that notification procedure, you can take action against them. That's somewhat oversimplifying it. So I wouldn't. If you're listening and you're trying to figure out how to comply, you need to dig in a little bit more on that. It still could end up being very problematic for employers, just because if someone has some unforeseen circumstances, for example, they're incapacitated, they don't give advance notice, employers will kind of have to go with it and pivot. And that is going to be hard for some industries like the 911 center or the home health care agency or an emergency room in a hospital where you've got minimum ratios of, kind of who needs to be doing what. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. And I think there is an opportunity to go back to the legislature and say, look, you fixed this, but you didn't do a good enough job. We need you to go further because of how this is actually working out and being able to use real world examples on that.
Now, we know we got to this point because of judicial activism and people not really following the Constitution. Whenever you have a new law like this, you're always going to have lawsuits and you're going to have people trying to challenge it. What were provisions either currently in the law or things that you were able to get out that hopefully will stem that tide of lawsuits?
Yeah, so the original statute, so I call it ESTA 1.0, and we're now in ESTA 2.0. So ESTA 1.0 really kind of curried favor to plaintiffs' attorneys across the state by saying employees who have complaints could go right away and find themselves an attorney and file a claim against an employer in court. The ESTA 2.0 removed that provision, which is very good, right? Administrative enforcement rests now with the state of Michigan. And, they do try to take a work with you first approach. And if they can't get you to work with them, well, then they're going to penalize. And then also the legislation, ESTA 2.0, removed the rebuttable presumption, or the big rebuttable presumption, that basically assumed that an employer was guilty before a complaint even got off the ground, that if employers didn't do certain things and they took certain actions against an employee, including discipline or termination, that it was assumed they were guilty unless they could prove otherwise. So kind of tilted the balance in favor of the employee. And that too was struck from ESTA 2.0. So some pretty big wins there that kind of fly under the radar because everybody's paying attention to the meat and the potatoes and the true compliance provisions, not realizing what they gained.
Now, this law is going to be so broad. As we said, it covers all industries, all sizes of business, with very few exemptions. When is implementation? How long do they have before they have to be up to speed and know everything that you know?
Yeah. So The answer is they need to be in compliance immediately. So the legislatures we talked about,
that's
that's
reasonable.
very, very practical, right?
Sounds like a government result.
The legislature, felt like they were under the gun. They needed to get this done before February 21, the date that the court ordered these sweeping new laws to take effect. And so what did they do? They passed the changes at about 11 p.m. on February 20, and then they went into effect at about 1 a.m. or 12:02 a.m., I think is the actual time, on February 21. So basically, employers had about 2 hours to get themselves educated and to be complying with the law. Obviously, that's not practical. That is going to be very difficult. Employers are still, there's a ton of questions the state doesn't even have an answer to in terms of compliance. And so, when we talk to the state, they say, okay, look, we're trying to take an education first approach on this. Yes, this is the law today, but we understand that this has been a big scramble. But employers will need to backdate the accrual or the front loading of time back to the start date of this legislation, and will need to work to get themselves in compliance as quickly as possible. One thing that we didn't talk about is that small businesses are dealt with a little bit differently than everyone else. So anyone who has 10 or less employees, they only need to provide 40 hours of sick leave annually, and they have until October 1 of this year to get themselves in compliance. So there's a little bit of breathing room for more. They call it small business, but it's really more of those micro businesses. But everyone else needs to be in compliance. And they had 30 days. So until March 22, I believe, is a day to get their posters up and to be giving written notice to their employees.
Yeah. Now, I know you've been out speaking a lot. You're in the media everywhere, and people bring you to speaking. For those who haven't heard you, what type of resources does the Michigan Chamber have? Where can people go to learn more about what they need to be doing and what they need to know about these two laws?
Yeah, so the Michigan Chamber really is trying to step into this space in a really big way by helping employers understand their compliance obligations and to get all of those pieces in place. So we have a number of webinars available on our website, michamber.com, under our training tab. We also have a toolkit that is available and chock full of great information, including an FAQ, including sample policies that you can use to update your handbook, sample notification to your employees, all sorts of great information that we've developed in conjunction with a number of HR and legal partners. And that can be found if you visit our website, michamber.com. There's a widget on our front page. If you just look for the words earn sick time and minimum wage, you can click there, or you can just enter into our search bar the word toolkit, and you'll get taken right to that compliance toolkit.
Great. Made it easy for everyone. Make sure they can get educated. As you said, that's the most important part. Just know what you're facing. Well, once again, time goes by fast. Wendy, a very special thanks for not only being here today, but all the work you did on this. You were a true leader in the state capitol, making sure that these laws were passed in a way most beneficial to job providers and employees across the state. To all of you, thank you for listening. Tune in to our next episode. Subscribe and like our podcast for easy notifications. And until next time, we hope you'll engage with us. Go to michamber.com.